going to read the first chapter of Little Obelia. Little Obelia and Further Adventures of Ragged Blossom, Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie. Here begins the story of Little Obelia. Now tell me, do you really think all the bad Bankshire men were deady bones when they went to the bottom of the sea in the great fight with Mr. Lizard and Mr. Eagle and Cuddle Pie? Were they deady bones? Not a bit of it, not one of them. When they came to the bottom of the sea, they sat up and rubbed the places where the stones had hit them and gazed about. As they sat there peering through the seaweed, a large carriage, drawn by sea dragons, floated above them and passed quickly out of sight. "Did you see that?" gasped the biggest bad Bankshire man. It was Ragged Blossom. "What?" shouted all the other bad Bankshire men. "It was Ragged Blossom, I tell you," he cried. "Squeeze and breeze her, root and shoot her," growled one. "Stone and bone her," spluttered another. "What's the good of talking?" said the biggest bad Bankshire man. "We must follow and catch her. This is the way they went. Come on." Then one of the bad Bankshire men said it wasn't the way, and they all began fighting and quarrelling about it. So great was the commotion that numbers of fish came swimming round. The bad Bankshire men stopped quarrelling and stared with wonder at the strange creatures. Suddenly, a huge fish came at them with its mouth wide open and was about to swallow them, but they turned and were just in time to save themselves by running into a curious house hidden amongst the tall sea flowers. Just as the bad last Bankshire man was squeezing in, they shut the door too soon and left his legs sticking out. The big fish darted at it and bit it off, and then went nosing around looking for more. Inside the house, the bad Bankshire men huddled together and shook with fear. "Ha ha!" croaked a terrible voice. Clutching each other, the Bankshire men stared into the dark corner where the voice seemed to be, and there they saw a dreadful eye looking at them. As they gazed in terror, out stole a long, creeping, crawling arm, and seizing one of the Bankshire men, drew him slowly into the dark corner. The big eye glared at them all the while. The bad Bankshire men were so terribly afraid that they couldn't move or speak. Then the horrible voice croaked again. "All of you, one by one, I shall eat all of you." And as the Bankshire men stared into the dark corner, they saw a great, bulgy monster with lots of long, creepy, crawling arms. And what do you think it was doing? It was eating up the bad Bankshire man. Now, when they saw this terrible sight, all the other Bankshire men fell on their faces and called aloud, "O monster, spare us. We will be your slaves. We will find for you the beautiful Ragged Blossom, that you may eat her. Only spare us." And they wept and tore their hair and rolled about in their fear. But the great monster silently went on eating up the Bankshire man till not one little bit was left. "Now," said the monster, "where is this Ragged Blossom? Can you fetch her to me?" "Yes, yes," cried the Bankshire men, looking up. "It is not enough," said the monster. "I want more. We will bring you nuts from the bush above." "How many?" asked the monster. "2," they said. "I must have hundreds," said the monster. "We will bring them," cried the Bankshire men. "Very well," said the monster. "You shall be my slaves and bring me plenty of nuts to eat. And if you fail me, I shall eat you all. So the bad Bankshire men became the slaves of the wicked and awful giant octopus.
Hello, I'm Charlie Veron. I'm a marine scientist, and with great pleasure, I'm going to read you now Chapter 2. I told you how Mr. Lizard carried Snugglepot and Cuddlepie on his back all the long, long way home, and how happy their mother and father were to see them again. You remember that? Well, Just imagine how excited all the blossoms and nuts were when they heard of the wonderful city of Big Bad, and how Snugglepot had lived under the sea with the fish folk. And most exciting of all, how poor little Ragged Blossom had stayed behind at the bottom of the sea because she could not bear to leave the little baby Obelia. Very well then. One warm spring day, Mr. Lizard sat smoking in his cool sitting room, thinking how blue the sky was through the window and how sweet the wattle scent was coming in through the door, when he heard a step on the veranda, and in walked Snugglepot. "Stump and bump me," exclaimed Mr. Lizard, jumping up and shaking him by both hands. "By gum, I am glad to see you. Sip your cap and sit down and tell me all the news." "I've been thinking about Ragged Blossom," said Snugglepot. "So have I," cried Mr. Lizard. "And so has Cuddlepie," continued Snugglepot. Well, mused Mr. Lizard. "That's strange." But stranger still, at that very moment, while they were talking of her, little Ragged Blossom, far, far away at the bottom of the deep green sea, was sitting before her phosphorescent fire, fast asleep, dreaming that she was back in the bush again with all her dear old friends. Now, wasn't that strange? "Yes, we've been thinking," continued Snugglepot, "that if she stays down in the sea too long, she'll turn into a fish folk and never be able to come back again." "Can't the fish folk come out then?" asked Mr. Lizard. "Goodness, no, they're dry," said Snugglepot. "Go Daddy Bones?" asked Mr. Lizard. "Quite," replied Snugglepot. "Dear, dear," murmured Mr. Lizard. "What a dreadful thought. Now, what's to be done?" "We think of going down to fetch her up," said Snugglepot. "I'll come too," Mr. Lizard roared excitedly, smacking his tail. "I'll most certainly come." "Good root," cried Snugglepot. "And now that's settled," said Mr. Lizard. "Let's go along and see the cricket, eh?" Snugglepot agreed, and off they went. "I suppose you'll be very glad to go down and see your friends, the fish folk?" asked Mr. Lizard as they strolled along. "Oh, yes," answered Snugglepot. "I love anchovy." "John Dory's a bit of a queer fish, isn't he?" asked Mr. Lizard, picking up a spray of native rose to flip the flies off with. "He used to be, but he's quite changed now," said Snugglepot. "And this baby Obelia, found in a sort of pearly thingamabob, wasn't it?" asked Mr. Lizard. "We found her," said Snugglepot proudly, "so we kept her. That's why Ragged Blossom stayed behind when I came up." "Dear, dear," said Mr. Lizard, who had often heard the story but enjoyed hearing it all over again. "And she's a sort of lost, what you may call it?" "Princess," said Snugglepot. "And she's to be queen of the fish folk when she grows big." Well, now," said Mr. Lizard, stopping and hunting for his spectacles, and when he found them at last, putting them on and looking solemnly at Snugglepot over the top. "A queen, eh? Well. And you think little what's-her-name?" "Obelia," put in Snugglepot. "Will be old enough to be left by now?" "Quite," said Snugglepot. Mr. Lizard took off his spectacles, and they strolled on again. Well. So that's it, is it? Dear me. By the way," he said, remembered, "where's Cuddlepie?" "Gone to the dentist," Snugglepot told him. "Ah," said Mr. Lizard, "that's a place I never go to. They ought to be against the law. Well, here we are." Having arrived at the cricket ground, they found a little grassy bank and sat themselves on it, quite unconscious of the long, dark form that followed them all the way, and two bright, black, beady eyes that were watching them from a bush nearby. It was a moment of exciting match, and they forgot all about everything in their enjoyment of the game. At last it was over, and they turned homewards. As it was still very warm, Snugglepot suggested that Mr. Lizard should drop in with him and have a cool drink and discuss plans for the journey. Mr. Lizard agreed, and in they went. "What will you have?" asked Snugglepot, going to his useful little cupboard. "Juice of sour suds, apes' milk, or some old sap?" "3 drinks of old sap, and fill it up with dew, thank you." So they quenched their thirst and drew their chairs together and lit their pipes. There was a window in the room they were sitting in, and before it hung a beautiful cobweb curtain. So earnestly were they talking, they did not notice a dark shadow which had been on the curtain, slowly moving across and disappear. "So the plans are safe?" sighed Mr. Lizard. "Safe as the riverbank," Snugglepot assured him. Suddenly there was a loud knocking at the door. "Come in," called Snugglepot. No one came in. "Who's there?" cried Snugglepot, going to the door and opening it. There was nobody there. "That's airy. Nobody there. Nobody." Mr. Lizard was puzzled. So he went and looked out. "Not a whiff," said Snugglepot. Now, while they were gazing out the door, something slipped silently in through the window, crossed over the floor, and glided under Snugglepot's bed. "Ah, well," said Mr. Lizard, going back to his chair. "Some silly soot playing jokes, I suppose. Now let's get to earth and settle our affairs." They pulled their chairs closer together and talked long and earnestly in low whispers, but not too low for every word to be heard by the 2 ears sticking out from under the bed close behind them. At last, Mr. Lizard got up. "Well, I must be going," he said, knocking out his pipe. "Don't forget, tomorrow, at Bird's Rise by Little Creek Waterfall. I'll go round and let the rest of the nuts know. Take care of the plans, Greg." "I will," said Snugglepot. And another loud knock at the door startled them. They both rushed for the door, stumbling over each other in their hurry. "Hello!" shouted Snugglepot, flinging open the door. "Who's there?" It was growing dark. "Nobody again," so Snugglepot peered out. "Extraordinary," said Mr. Lizard, peering out also. Neither of them saw a shadowy form that crept silently out from under the bed, glided to the window, and climbing noiselessly through, disappearing into the dark.
Hello, I'm Alison Lester, and I write and illustrate children's books. As Cuddlepie walked along towards the dentist's, he began to feel more and more miserable. "I hate dentists," he said aloud. "I'd sooner be Daddy Bones than go there. Suppose I don't go." He sat down on a log to think about it. As he sat there, resting his sore face on his hand, ow, can imagine how it would hurt, a blossom came running along the road, sobbing bitterly. "Why, what's the matter?" asked Cuddlepie kindly. Toothache," sobbed Little Blossom. "Oh, come with me," said Cuddlepie cheerfully, "and I'll show you a nice, kind dentist. He'll soon cure you." And taking her hand, he led her gently down the road. They had not gone very far when they came upon Mrs. Bear sitting by the roadside, rocking to and fro and groaning deeply. "Oh, what's the matter, Mrs. Bear?" asked Cuddlepie and the Little Blossom. Oh, groaned the bear. "I've got a dreadful face ache." "Then come along with us. We're going to the dentist. He'll cure you. He's so kind." Mrs. Bear stopped groaning, got up heavily from her seat and lumbered along behind them. Not very far on, they came to a little hut. There was a terrible noise inside, shrieks and yells, so they all stopped. Cuddlepot rang up and banged on the door. "What's up?" he shouted. The growls and yelps stopped. Mr. Possum opened the door. "I'm trying to uproot a tooth and it won't let go," he moaned. Cuddlepot persuaded him to join the party, telling him how nice and kind the dentist was, and off they set again. Presently they came to a little grey furry kangaroo who was hitting his head with a stick as hard as he could. "Oh, don't," they all cried, "you'll hurt yourself." "That's just what I want to do," answered the kangaroo, hitting himself harder than ever. "Ow, ow, ow." "Goodness," said Cuddlepie, "why do you want to hurt yourself?" "I like it better than toothache." The kangaroo moaned. "Dear me," said everybody shaking their heads at each other. "Another one. You'd better follow me to the dentist," advised Cuddlepie. "He's so nice," said Blossom. "So kind," murmured Mrs. Bear. "So gentle," put in Possum. "A dear," they all cried. "Way to jump," said the kangaroo. "I'll fill my pouch and hop after you quick sticks." A dismal howling greeted them at the next corner, and running over to a fence, they found Mrs. Dingo and 6 little yellow dingoes with their heads up, yowling piteously. "Oh, oh." The little dingoes told them their mother had toothache. "Never mind," said Cuddlepie. "Come and see the dentist. Mrs. Dingo and the little dingoes can see the teeth pulled out." So they joined the party and trotted along after the others. They all hopped, flumbered and trotted after Cuddlepie, gathering more bush folk as they went, till quite a crowd was following him. At last they reached the dentist. They found the waiting room so crowded that most of them had to stay outside. "Gummy," said Cuddlepie with a sigh of relief. "No good me waiting," and off he went, so happy at getting away from the dentist that he sang and jumped about as he went along. "It's funny," he said aloud, "what a long, long way it is to the dentist and what a little way it is coming back." "I've noticed that too," said a voice in his ear. Cuddlepot was startled and looked about, but could see no one. "It seems strange," said Cuddlepot to himself, "that everybody should have toothache today." "Quite simple," answered the voice. "There's a sale on at the honey shop." "Where's that voice?" cried Cuddlepie, stopping and looking around everywhere. "Here it is," chuckled the voice mockingly, and out from a hole right at his feet popped the head of Mrs. Snake. Not Mrs. Snake that was killed outside the Gum Inn, of course, but another Mrs. Snake, Mrs. Black Snake. Cuddlepie jumped back. He knew what a poisonous person Mrs. Black Snake was. "It's a warm day," murmured Cuddlepie politely, moving off and trying to look unafraid. "Middling hot," said Mrs. Snake, "but don't be in such a hurry. I've news for you." "News?" cried Cuddlepie. "From a friend of yours who lives in the sea." Cuddlepie stood still, astonished. "Who do you mean?" He stammered. "A letter from little Ragged Blossom to you," answered Mrs. Snake, coming right out of a hole and swaying about near Cuddlepie till he felt his back go all creepy. "If you come with me," she said softly, curving herself a little closer, "I'll show you. I found it floating in the creek. It was sticking in the wing of a shag that was—" "What?" asked Cuddlepie eagerly. "Daddy bones," chuckled Mrs. Snake. "How?" asked Cuddlepie, shocked. "Humans, I suppose. Good thing too. I hate shag," she added venomously. "I expect you hate everything," said Cuddlepie. "Why should I?" hissed Mrs. Snake. "'Cause everything hates you." And Cuddlepie looked hard into her wicked little eyes. "That means you do," wheezed Mrs. Snake, flicking her forked tongue in and out and stretching her neck till she was only a few inches from Cuddlepie's face. "So it's yes, is it?" she hissed, getting nearer and nearer and swaying her head backwards and forwards. "Sleep, sleep, sleep," she hissed, and Cuddlepie still looked into her eyes. Now they seemed to grow bigger and nearer. Now they seemed to grow bigger and bigger and nearer and nearer. And then they faded away, for Cuddlepie had fallen into a sleep, a strange sleep. Mrs. Snake had hypnotized him, just as she does poor little birds and other bush creatures. Now, she said, perhaps you'll have the goodness to follow me. And Cuddlepie did. Not very far away, a number of Banksia men were sitting in a Banksia tree, basking in the sun and planning mischief. Looking down, one of them spied Mrs. Snake and Cuddlepie. Aha, he cried, jumping about and shaking the bough till all the Banksia men's heads were knocking together. There's one of them, she's got him. Bunch him and scrunch him, shouted one. Hit him and spit him, growled another. String him and ring him, snarled a third. Then they all jumped about, grunting and clattering and shaking the bough till the leaves rattled. Stop that noise and listen to me, commanded Mrs. Snake, twisting her body into a knot of annoyance. I've had a letter from the big boss Banksia man. All their Banksia men touched their toes with their heads to show their respect for the boss Banksia man. He is down in the sea and the rest are with him. The giant octopus has them in his power. We are to catch and send him the slimy sinners, Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, and as many more nuts as we can trap, for only so can they escape being eaten by the giant. And what do we get for our trouble? Growled a little stubby Banksia with red hair and squinty eyes. More than you deserve, hissed Mrs. Snake. The boss is sending wonderful treasure. It is to be laid in a cave by the sea at Big Bad City. Where's Mr. Snake? Asked the redhead Banksia man. Why can't he do something? He's spying on him now, snapped Mrs. Snake. About time you made some plans yourselves instead of leaving it all to me. It's your pleasure, snarled a big back Banksia man. You enjoy it. So do you, said Mrs. Snake, spitting her tongue in and out.
Come on, she added, turning to Cuddlepie, twisting and wriggling her body in anger. She slid away into her hole. Mrs. Snake's house consisted of one big room at the end of a long passage. It was a cool room with a round window in the ceiling. The window was open, and over it hung trails of delicate green maidenhair fern. Pulling Cuddlepie in after her, Mrs. Snake tied his hands and feet with strong grass, pushed him into a corner, and rolled a heavy stone against him. There, she said. Now I'll go out and find something to eat. There's not a morsel in the house. And smiling a wickedly sly smile, she slid out and away up the passage. Now you remember Winky Jerboa, the poor little stowaway, and how unhappy he was when he went home to Big Bad City and found that all his people had gone away? Well, he kept the house and the garden tidy, laid in stores, and waited. But neither his mother nor father nor sisters nor brothers ever came back. So poor little Winky left home again and roamed from place to place, hoping that someday he might find them. So here we see him limping with tiredness, carrying his bundle like any old tramp. Oh, this looks like a nice cool place, he said, dropping his bundle and sitting down beside it. I think I'll rest. The afternoon was warm and the scent of the rock lilies made him drowsy. Slowly, the long lashes covered his big brown eyes, and lower drooped his weary head, till at length he sank right down upon the cool green moss, sound asleep. A tiny brown lizard ran over him. Winky didn't stir. A big blue butterfly lit upon his little damp nose. His whiskers twitched, but Winky did not wake. A spider, letting himself down from the fern above, landed upon the tip of his soft ear, but Winky did not wake. Two kookaburras flew into the tree overhead and laughed and chatted for a while, but Winky did not wake. Some big frogs croaked in a pool nearby, but Winky did not wake. A bright green beetle climbed clumsily all the way along his tail, but Winky did not wake. Two willy wagtails came and danced all over him, but Winky did not wake. Mrs. Snake came out of her hole, saw Winky, and exclaimed, "Such a sight! Food at my very door." Then Winky woke. He sprang up as if he had been blown up, and as he sat up, he shrieked, "Help!" Now a cousin of Mr. Lizard's happened to be driving down the road, and on hearing the cry, he pulled up his bandicoots. "Help!" came the cry again, but it sounded fainter this time. Mr. Lizard sprang from his wagon and rushed into the bush. There sat poor little Winky, white and stiff with fear. Reared before him, ready to strike, was the terrible Mrs. Snake. Though Mr. Lizard was only a little chap, he sprang upon her without a moment's hesitation, and in a flash he had her by the neck, his strong hand squeezing her till she squealed for mercy. "Run!" he called to little Winky. "Run for your life, and don't stop till you're home." Poor little Winky was so frightened that at first he could hardly move. "Run! Run!" shouted Mr. Lizard, for he felt her slipping. So while they fought and rolled about, Winky picked up his bundle and dashed away as fast as his tired little legs could carry him. He ran and ran till suddenly the ground gave way beneath him and he fell, crash, thud, right into the middle of, where do you think? Why, right into the middle of Mrs. Snake's house. But he wasn't hurt, so he picked himself up and was about to dash out the door when he noticed something lying in the corner. "Cuddlepie!" he gasped in amazement. "Poor Cuddlepie someone has done him Daddy Bones! Poor Cuddlepie!" And he untied the bands and lifted him up. At this moment, there was a rustling noise, and there in the doorway swayed Mrs. Snake. Winky was frozen in horror. "Ah!" hissed Mrs. Snake, raising her head. "I have you." But as she spoke, her throat swelled, her eyes turned purple, and with one bound into the air, she fell at Winky's feet, and there she lay, for she was wounded. Winky saw his chance. Holding Cuddlepie tightly in his arms, he sprang clear across her body and out of the door. Staggering and stumbling, he found his way up the dark passage and at last, with a cry of relief, fell out into the sunshine. But there was no time to lose. Half crying and half dragging poor Cuddlepie, he managed to find a hiding place in a hollow tree. Oh, joy! A door opened and there stood kind Mrs. Possum. "Take us in," panted Winky. "Mrs. Snake, oh, be quick!" And without waiting for more news, Mrs. Possum helped them in, and what's more, Mrs. Possum took poor Cuddlepie and bathed his face and gave him medicine and soon brought him out of his strange sleep. "What's happened?" asked Cuddlepie, opening his eyes, and they told him. "There must be mischief about," said Cuddlepie. "I must hurry home." Then he saw Winky, and there was more talk. "Stay here till it gets quite dark, and then I'll see you on the way," said kind Mrs. Possum. And so they did.
Hi everyone, I'm Dave Booth. I'm a Professor of Marine Ecology at University of Technology in Sydney, and I'm about to read you Chapter 4 of Little Obelia. So the moon was up, full and round, when Cuddlepie and Winky, having said goodbye to Mr. Possum, stopped at Snugglepot's house and knocked at the door. All was still within. Cuddlepie knocked again. No answer. They both knocked. Not a stir inside. Then they knocked and shouted and knocked, and made so much noise that a party of nuts, returning very late from the Gum Inn, asked what the matter was. "We can't get in," said Snugglepie. "Climb in through a window," suggested a nut. "It's too high," answered Cuddlepie. "Oh, that's easy," laughed the nuts. And before you could say Robin Redbreast, they had piled themselves on each other's shoulders until quite a long ladder was made. But it was just too short. When Cuddlepie climbed up, he could only catch the windowsill with one hand. Suddenly Winky, who was looking on, ran like lightning up over all of them and clean in at the window. Once there, he easily helped Cuddlepie in. So they thanked the nuts, who then unmade the ladder and went on their way. When Cuddlepie looked about, he found to his astonishment that Snugglepot was nowhere to be seen. "What's this?" said Winky. It was the middle of a table and a mug tied to it, a leaf, on one side of which was written, "Drink this, Cuddlepie, it cures toothache." And on the other, "Then come to the waterfall at Little Creek." "How kind of Snugglepot," said Cuddlepie. "It's just what I need." Have some, Winky. No, thank you, said Winky, who didn't like the smell of it. Cuddlepie was always good at taking medicine, tipped up the mug and swallowed it all. No sooner had he done so than a strange look came over his face, and he began to dance and sing and turn somersaults. Then, catching Winky by the end of his tail, he threw open the door, whisked him out, and went tearing off down the road, dragging the astonished Winky after him. By this time, it was early bird rise, and a crowd of nuts had gathered at the Little Creek waterfall as arranged to meet Mr. Lizard and Snugglepie. When Cuddlepie and Winky bowled into their midst, they all threw up their caps and laughed and sang. Then some nuts saw a large sign on the tree. It read, "Who'll follow me down to the sea?" And then was a newly cut track leading into the bush. "I will," shouted Cuddlepie, waving his cap. "Come along, Nuts." And away he went like mad, the rest all after him, helter-skelter along the new track. They had not gone far when they came to another notice saying, "Don't turn back, this is the track." So on they went. To a by and by they came to another sign. "This is the way, merry and gay." Off they went again. Presently the track took a sudden downturn into a steep gully. At the bottom splashed and gurgled a mighty stream, and here was another signboard. "To the Lizard Bridge, go over the ridge." Then all turned back over the ridge, and there they saw a monster lizard standing across the stream, his front legs on one bank and his back legs on the other. The lizard took no notice of the nuts or of the deeper water rushing under him. He just stood there, blinking his sleepy eyes and licking up any stray ants that came along. All the nuts clambered up to where his tail was smallest, walking along his huge body and crossing safely to the other side. All except Cuddlepie, who, because he danced and skipped about, lost his balance when he got into the middle and fell splash into the stream. The rushing water made so much noise that nobody heard his shouts, and most of the nuts were away over the hill before anyone knew what had happened. When they heard about it, there was much disturbance. Some were for going back, but others said, "No, it is best to go on and tell Snugglepot who will be waiting for us." All the nuts agreed to do this, so away they went once more, leaving little Winky Jerboa sitting on the middle of the track, weeping and wringing his hands. At length, when the sun was high overhead, they came to another notice. It said, "Just around the bend is the journey's end." By this time, they were all very tired and so hot that when they turned the bend, they saw before them the beautiful wide blue sea. They threw up their caps and shouted for joy. Lying close beside the rocks was a fine tall ship. They all clambered aboard, calling loudly for Snugglepot. But there wasn't a soul to be seen, and there written on the vessel's side were the words, "If you want to find me, jump into the sea." On seeing that, the nuts were delighted, and without waiting a moment, they pushed the ship out from the rocks till it floated over the deep, deep water. There, climbing on the side, they all sprang off, just like a lot of pink frogs, and went swimming down, down, down into the cool green sea. Now, let us leave them at all and see what happened to Cuddlepie. At first, when he found himself being carried along at such a pace, he felt afraid, but after a while he began to rather like it. He just floated along, enjoying the scenery as he went by. It was very much like riding on a train, only of course he didn't know that as he'd never been on one. Once he passed some great red kangaroos drinking at the water's edge. Another time he was swept almost into the arms of an astonished old platypus. And another time he was able to rescue a tiny baby bird which had fallen from his nest by pushing it to a clump of green ferns as he rushed past. So in no time at all, he found himself swirling and whirling right away from the land and out into the sea. Then something caught hold of his legs and dragged him under so quickly that he couldn't think or hear or see. When Cuddlepie opened his eyes again, he didn't know where he was. All above him and all about him was water, and a pale green light flooding everything. He was lying on a curious little bed, sticking out high on a wall. There were a number of other beds like this, also sticking out on the wall. While he was looking about, a strange creature came floating up to him and gave him something queer to eat. Where am I, please? Asked Cuddlepie. And what's this? Fishes, eggs. You're in a hospital, answered the nurse, who was a fish folk. Then she swam away again before he could ask any more questions. Scrub and rub me, thought Cuddlepie. How did I get here? Just then he heard voices. Peeping over the side of the bed, he saw to his great amazement, away down on the floor below him, walking around and talking. Well, who was it? Why, dear little Ragged Blossom. Cuddlepie was so surprised he swallowed all the eggs in a gulp and nearly fell out of bed. He tried to call to her, but his head went all woozy and he sank back helpless. Yes, it was Ragged Blossom, and with her were little Obelia and Anchovy, and a boy with a large basket of presents for the patients. While Anne was talking to Dr. Fuscus, Carp, and the nurse, Ragged Blossom went about comforting the patients. She liked going with Anne to cheer up the poor sick fish folk, and she always used to pay special attention to the new patients, for she thought they would feel so lonely. She could climb up to speak to one who looked very miserable, with his head all covered up and only a little bit of hair sticking out the top. Won't you have a flower? She asked gently. The patient shook his bedclothes but made no answer. Oh, do please, begged Ragged Blossom. All right then, snapped the patient and popped his head out. Ragged Blossom fell off the stool in horror. It was the great shaggy head and ugly face of a Banksia man. With a cry of fear, she ran to Anchovy. Eel's fins, exclaimed the nurse. Great starfish, bubbled the doctor. What's the matter, little one? Asked Anne. The man in the bed there, whispered Ragged Blossom. Oh, I'm so frightened. Come home, Anne. He won't hurt you, smiled Dr. Fuscus. We brought him in this morning, one leg off, small boy with him, sick. Like to see him? Oh, come home, wailed Ragged Blossom. Seeing that she was really upset, Anne hastily said goodbye and, taking little Billy by the hand, hurried away. Just as they were going out of the door, Cuddlepie, roused from his dizziness, sat up and saw Ragged Blossom. Ragged Blossom, he called, leaning out and waving his arms to her. Come back, it's me, Cuddlepie. Come back, come back. But Ragged Blossom didn't see or hear him, and as the big door closed behind her, poor little Cuddlepie put his head down upon his pillow and wept.
My name's Thomas Mesaglio. I'm a researcher from UNSW at the Centre for Ecosystem Science. Now at last, we come to little Obelia. She is very important, so listen carefully while I tell you about her. When she was a wee speck of a baby, she lay asleep in a pearl at the bottom of the sea. All round her grew beautiful Obelia seaweeds. That is why they called her Obelia. And thousands of rainbow-coloured fish guarded her night and day. There, she lay for years and years, and while she slept, a wonderful wisdom grew in her, though her little body remained the same. I can't tell you why or how, but it was so. At last, one day, the pearl burst open and spread out into a beautiful white flower. And that, you remember, was when Ragged Blossom and Snugglepot found her. From that time on, Obelia grew very quickly, and now, as you see in the picture, she is as big as Ragged Blossom. And she was much wiser. So wise, indeed, that not only Anchovy, but John Dory and all the cleverest fish folk for miles round came to ask her advice on matters of great importance. So when they came home from the hospital and Ragged Blossom told Obelia of the bad Banksia men, she went quietly to her thinking room and counted her pearls. She always did this when she was troubled about anything. She had hundreds of pearls, some big enough to build a house with, and some so little that they were nearly out of sight. When Obelia had counted her pearls, she went to Anne and said, "Come with me to the flower stall, man. He has something to tell you." So they went. Ragged Blossom and Obelia hovered about, loving the beautiful flowers and putting their faces into them. For sea flowers are like land flowers. The closer you look into them, the more beautiful they seem. Meanwhile, Anne bought a lovely red bunch, and while she was paying him, the old flower seller leant close and whispered in her ear, "There is danger following you." "How?" asked Anne eagerly. "The little one called Ragged Blossom," whispered the old man. "The shadows are about her." "Oh, tell me, what is it?" Anne begged. "It is the evil one, the great giant octopus. He sends his shadows out to catch her." "Shadows?" asked Anne, trembling. "Black shadows with shaggy heads and many eyes," answered the old man. At this terrible news, Anne grew so afraid that she called quickly to Ragged Blossom and Obelia, and, thanking the old flower man for his kindness, she took their hands and hurried home. Then Anne told them what she had heard. "Don't be afraid, little jellyfish," said Obelia, kissing Ragged Blossom and clasping her tightly. "I will take care of you." Then, without another word, she went to her thinking room. Again, she counted her pearls, and when she had counted the last littlest one, she came back to Anne. "Dear Anne," she said, "go back to the hospital and bring away the little pink boy." "Oh no," cried Ragged Blossom. "The Banksia man is there. Don't go." "Yes, I will go," said Anne. Ragged Blossom rushed out to the stables. She threw her arms about the neck of her favorite dragon and whispered, "Bring Anne safely back from the hospital. Go quickly and come swiftly." Then she went to the old coachman and begged him to take care of Anne. Then she found John Dory and pleaded with him to go to the hospital also. Although he was very busy polishing his scales, John patted her kindly and said he would go. Long and anxiously, little Obelia and Ragged Blossom waited at the garden gates, and at last they saw the carriage coming in the distance. The lovely dragons came swim-loping home, and there, sitting between John and Anne, smiling and chatting, sat little Cuddle Pie. It was a wonderful surprise. Ragged Blossom and Cuddle Pie were so happy, and everyone was so glad because they were so happy, that all thought of the Banksia men and their evil shadows vanished away. So Cuddle Pie came to live with John Dory and his kind wife Anne, and learned to play tramelnet and ride the dragons and eat sea cucumbers. And most of all, he learned to love Ragged Blossom's little pet fish, Frilly.
Hi, I'm April McCabe. I am a town planner, a placemaker, and all-round city nerd, an urban sociologist, you might say. And I'm about to read chapter 6 to you all. But where do you suppose Snugglepot and Mr. Lizard were all this time? When we last saw Snugglepot, he had gone to bed and he fell asleep wondering why Cuddle Pie was so long at the dentist. You remember? Well, he had hardly been asleep 2 ticks when he woke with a start. There was a loud knocking at the door. Snugglepot sprang out of bed shouting as he threw open the door, "I'll catch you this time." To his great surprise, there stood Mr. Lizard. He seemed very upset and out of breath. "What's the matter?" cried Snugglepie. "Oh, gum!" gasped Mr. Lizard, sinking into a chair and fanning himself with the tip of his tail. "Whatever is the matter?" repeated Snugglepot. It's Cuddle Pie," moaned Mr. Lizard. "He's caught." "Caught?" gasped Snugglepot. "The Banksia men have got him," groaned Mr. Lizard. "Oh, gum, 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 what shall we do?" "How? When? Who?" asked Snugglepot very excitedly. "An old tramp came to my house and told me," he said. "He saw the Banksia men hit Cuddle Pie on the head, put him into a bag, and run off down the road. to Big Bad City, lickety-plick. Snugglepot was pulling on his travelling leaves. "We must get off after him, quick, Sticks," he cried, reaching for his cap. "Rag and scrag me," shouted Mr. Lizard, jumping up. "Oh, silly scoot cinder that I am! Why didn't I think of that? The plans!" cried Snugglepot, rushing to the little hole he kept them in. Dr. Faustus carp, seeing the Banksia men had only one leg, for he was the one whose leg had been bitten off when they were all rushed into the house of the giant octopus, took the Banksia men into his carriage and carried them to the hospital. "For," he said, "I can make you a new leg," and the little boy looked ill, so a few days in a shell will do him good. After that, the Banksia men had to do what he was told. So when he saw Anne taking Cuddlepie away, he could only grind his teeth in rage, and he kicked so hard that his new leg came off and had to fix it all over again. You see what a wicked plot Mrs. Snake and the Banksia men had made. Now what had become of all the nuts who jumped into the sea? And where is little Winky Gerbera? All in good time, you should know. First, let's go with Snugglepot and Mr. Lizard and see what happens to them. Old Mr. Lizard galloped and galloped, sometimes stumbling into holes, sometimes jumping logs and scrambling over rocky places, and sometimes shying in the strange shadows cast by the moon. Snugglepot clung to his back with great difficulty, and all night they hastened on till at last they were, just as a pale light was stealing into the sky, Mr. Lizard could go no farther, and they stopped by a little waterhole to drink. An old tramp hobbled up to them as they were resting. "Morning, mates," he said. "Making a long journey?" "To the Big Bad City," Snugglepot told him. "I've just come from there," he said. Mr. Lizard asked him anxiously if he had passed anyone on the way. "I seen rough-looking blokes, very rough-looking they was. One of 'em were dragging a little cove along and hitting him over the head with a stick. Hitting him cruel it was." Snugglepot and Mr. Lizard had heard enough. With a bound, Snugglepot was on Mr. Lizard's back, and Mr. Lizard was off up the road as if he were the wind. The old tramp burst out laughing and threw off the cloak that covered his head. As he gazed after them, he shook his fist and growled, "Travel on, there's someone waiting for you in the Big Bad, but yet it ain't your slimy Cuddlepie." All the next day they pushed on, till at last they knew by the number of the houses they passed and the crowds of people that they were nearing Big Bad City. Once they were nearly run over by a motor car, and numbers of young nuts on scooters made them quite nervous. Then they saw a big crowd of nuts watching a football match. But on they went, poor Mr. Lizard's tongue hanging out and Snugglepie stiff with holding on. Still they went on. By and by they came to a big river. There were crowds of nuts and blossoms on the banks. Boats were racing and the crowds were cheering. It was most exciting, but on they went till the last they came right to the great city of Big Bad. All the time, as they went along, they kept asking people if they had seen a Banksia man with a little nut. No one had seen him. Mr. Lizard was so tired by this time that, spying an old shed, he hobbled into it, fell down and fast asleep. Snugglepot arranged some grass under Mr. Lizard's head as a pillow and then stole out, for he was very hungry. Just a little way up the street, he came to a splendid tea shop. It was cheaper on the roof, so he went up. "This is juicy," thought Snugglepot, as he sat at a small round table and ordered some grass root cakes and milk. "Isn't it a nice blue day?" he said to the plump blossom who was sitting opposite. "'Tis a scented afternoon," agreed the blossom. "The cicadas are so trilly." "Rippling," said Snugglepot. "Did you see the regatta?" "Not quite," murmured the blossom. "Was it good?" "Treetop," said Snugglepot. "And the football match?" "Just missed it," sighed the blossom. "Was it exciting?" "Simply bumpings," replied Snugglepot, sucking at his straw. "My husband is an artist," said the blossom with pride. "Why," she explained, "you are the nut who came to our house with Dr. Hodges Stickus," cried Snugglepot and the blossom in one breath. The blossom turned quite pink. "Oh dear," she gasped. "What a fright you've given me. I heard you were drowned in the sea." Only a little, said Snugglepot, and they laughed and chatted, and by the Blossom asked Snugglepot to come home with her to see her husband. But what about my friend Mr. Lizard? Bring him too, said the Blossom. Thank you, said Snugglepot, but when he looked into the shed, Mr. Lizard was gone. Where can he be? Exclaimed Snugglepot. So strange, said the Blossom, but my house is only just across the road. We'll send a servant to keep watch for him. So saying, she led the way home. The artist was delighted to see Snugglepot and begged him to camp there with him for a long time. So he did, and every day he went out looking for Cuddlepie and Mr. Lizard, but never could he see or hear anything of them, till at last he grew quite thin with anxiety. One day the artist asked Snugglepot to come into his studio to see a picture he had painted for the important exhibition soon to be open. There is a prize for the liveliest looking picture. I want to get it. As he said this, he threw open his studio door, and there, seated in a chair, comfortably looking back and smoking a pipe, was, who do you think? Why, old Mr. Lizard himself, as large as life. Snugglepot rushed in and was just about to embrace him when the artist caught him by the neck. What? He cried. You could spoil my picture, you rat, you bat, you native cat. And he shook Snugglepot till his eyes jumped. Oh, cried poor Snugglepot. I thought it was alive. It was my lost friend. And then out from behind a long green curtain stepped old Mr. Lizard. Snugglepot was overjoyed. There was great merriment at the artist's home that night. Dr. Hockus Stickus came around to dinner, and everyone declared the picture to be lifelike. Now it happened that another artist in Big Bad had decided to get the prize for the alivest picture, and most strange to say, he had chosen his model, a Banksia man. There was great excitement on the opening day. All the artists and other queer people went to see the pictures. When Snugglepot saw the portrait of the Banksia man, it looked so real that he felt quite nervous. A great eye seemed to blink at him. He stood rooted with horror. Then suddenly the picture burst open, and out from the frame sprung the Banksia man, almost on top of him. With a terrible yell, the Banksia man seized Snugglepot by the legs, and scattering the people right and left, he ran from the gallery. The artist rushed after him, shouting, "Murder! Help! Stop him!" But the Banksia man's long legs covered the ground so quickly that he turned so many different ways that no one could catch him, and soon the shouts died away in the distance. All this time, poor Snugglepot's head was going around and around, and he nearly fainted with the pain of being carried upside down. It's very cruel to carry any live thing upside down. Remember that. Suddenly, the Banksia man darted into a doorway and down a long passage, climbed a lot of steps, groped through a long, dark tunnel, and came out into a cave at the end. In the cave were a number of Banksia men smoking, arguing, and playing bones. When they saw Snugglepot, they all gathered around. "Got him at last," said the Banksia man, panting. "Is he alive?" grunted one, poking Snugglepot with his horrible bony finger. "Is he what?" sneered the Banksia man, tossing Cuddlepot into a corner. What'll we do with him? That's the question. The little slimy sinner growled one. "String and ring him," said the other. "Rack and crack him," snarled another. "Bust and rust him," croaked a monster with 3 eyes. "Stick him on a bull ant's nest and they'll kill him, and the crows will come and pick his bones," squeaked the smallest, ugliest of them all. Throw him to the bulldogs," shouted all the Banksia men, jumping about in wicked glee. "Give him a dose first," muttered one of them. So they opened poor Snugglepot's mouth and poured some horrible juice into it, and that was the last thing Snugglepot remembered. Now old Mr. Lizard, being a very sporting fellow, had sneaked off to the races instead of going to the picture gallery with Snugglepot, the artist. When he came home, his cap on one side and swinging his cane jauntily, he was amazed to find Mrs. Artist in tears and Mr. Artist saying the most dreadful words. No sooner had the terrible news gone into his ears than he dashed out of the door. Old Mr. Lizard was a sensible person, so he argued with himself as to which way the Banksia man would most likely have gone when he ran from the picture gallery. And sure enough, he guessed it well, For as he passed a doorway, he espied just inside upon the ground a little green cap. It was Snugglepot's. He knew it was the plan sticking inside. In less time than it takes to tell, old Mr. Lizard was standing outside the Banksia men's cave, breathing hard and listening. Well, come on, he heard one say. If we're going to cop that slimy lizard, we must be going. Mr. Lizard flattened himself against the wall. In his hands he held a heavy stick with a knobbly end. The first Banksia man came out of the dark passage. Whack went Mr. Lizard's stick, and down went the Banksia man. One, muttered Mr. Lizard under his breath, kicking the Banksia man to one side. Out came another Banksia man. Whack went Mr. Lizard's stick. Down went the Banksia man. Two, whispered Mr. Lizard. Out came another Banksia man. Thud went Mr. Lizard's stick. Down went the Banksia man. Out came another Banksia man. Flop went Mr. Lizard's stick, and down went the Banksia man. Out came two Banksia men together. Whack, whack went Mr. Lizard's stick. Six, murmured Mr. Lizard, swinging his stick. No more Banksia men came. Not a sound in the cave. Mr. Lizard peeped in. Not a soul there. Yes, just one poor little Snugglepot lying still and white, his hand and feet tied and his eyes closed. Mr. Lizard stooped down. He started back. Deady bones, he groaned. Alas, alas, why did I go to the races? Mr. Lizard flew into a passion of rage, weeping and saying dreadful words. He pulled all the Banksia men into a heap in the middle of the cave and set fire to them. Then lifting Snugglepot tenderly in his arms, he fled from the place, moaning and weeping as he went. And that really was the end of those wicked Banksia men.
Hi, my name is Derrick Cruz. I work with the Sydney Institute of Marine Science and the University of New South Wales. All this time, Cuddlepie had been living happily with the fish folk, enjoying the wonderful sights and almost wishing he were a fish folk himself. Ragged Blossom was so glad to have him. Anchovy and John Dory were so kind to him. Obelia was so wonderful. She was taller than Anne and wiser than ever. One day when she was holding the council, for she was queen of the fish folk, now there was a great commotion in the palace, and a prisoner was brought before her. Throwing himself down, the Banksia man pleaded for mercy. What has he done? Asked Obelia. But without waiting for an answer, she rose from her throne and hurried to her thinking room. She had scarcely counted a lapful of pearls when she sprang up, and spilling the pearls as she ran, rushed into the council chamber. The villain, she cried, throw him to the sharks. He and his black shadows have taken our ragged Blossom. They have cast her into the bottomless sea, where the days are as nights. I have seen it. Throw him to the sharks. Away with him. At these words, the councillors turned pale, for in fish folkdom, no thought is so dreadful as the fear of the bottomless sea. There is just one chance, said Obelia. Send Cuddlepie to the fish sauce shop. Alone? Gasped John Dory. Yes, alone, commanded Obelia. A shudder ran through the council room. Give him his words and let him go, said Obelia. A little while later, Cuddlepie, trembling but brave, pushed his way through the great swing doors of the mysterious fish sauce shop. As he went in, the shagged head of a Banksia man peered out of a window. At the same moment, a little black and white fish swam into a niche just over the doorway. It was Frilly. Say the words, called a loud voice as Cuddlepie entered. Cuddlepie started back. On each side and in front of him were the open mouths of hungry-looking fish. Rows of sharp teeth glistened all around him. Say the words, repeated the voice. Cuddlepie was stiff with fear. He couldn't remember one word, yet he had said them over and over all the way. Too late. Eat him, shouted the voice fiercely. But just as the open mouths came at him, Cuddlepie made a great effort and began. She stood at the door of the fish sauce shop, welcoming him in. At the first word, the hungry fish turned. At the last word, they vanished. Pass on, called the voice. Cuddlepie, still trembling, but still brave, went through a huge archway of shark's teeth and found himself in a beautiful white hall made of coral. All around the sides ran a little balcony, and in the middle of the floor was a deep black hole. As Cuddlepie stood there, wondering what the voice would say next, a strange and wonderful fish swam round the hall and stopped before him. On his head, brilliant flashing lights of phosphorus, and harnessed with a bright red saddle from which hung a little sharp spear. Mount the messenger, take the spear, and be prepared to descend, called a mysterious voice. Cuddlepie climbed into the saddle. Hold tightly to the messenger and say the words, commanded the voice. Cuddlepie repeated the words. At the sound of the last word, the messenger dived into the black hole, clinging to the harness with one hand and clutching his spear in the other. A terrible noise in his ears and a dreadful fear in his heart. Cuddlepie descended down into the bottomless sea. All was black dark. Cuddlepie shut his eyes. He could not bear to look at it. Presently, he opened them. All around him were flashing lights, and coming straight at him was a huge sea monster with fiery lights along his body and round his head, and the most terrible eyes and longest teeth Cuddlepie had ever seen. Just as the great thing came rushing upon him, Cuddlepie lifted his spear and drove it right into the monster's throat. With a terrible gurgle, it sunk away into the dark. But before him was another great sea monster. Cuddlepie uttered a cry, for there, standing in its open mouth, all lit by phosphorescence, stood little Ragged Blossom, holding out her arms to him. In a flash, Cuddlepie had snatched her out, and the messenger turned his flashing headlights upwards. They rose and rose, till suddenly they came right into the wonderful hall again. As they came to the edge of the balcony, the great voice said, say the words. Now Cuddlepie was so excited at having found Ragged Blossom that he stammered out. She stood at the door of the fish shop. Well, come in. Immediately, there was a terrific explosion, then a black darkness. The sea was calm, and only a few rippling wavelets licked the small brown rock on which Ragged Blossom lay, drying in the sun. Inquisitive seabirds circled about her, while under the water, Frilly swam round and round the rock in an agony of mind. He had patiently waited outside the fish sauce shop for Cuddlepie. Then came the terrible noise, and Frilly found himself thrown up to the surface of the sea. When he recovered from his fright, he swam about looking for Cuddlepie, and spying along the top, he saw the seabirds clustering about the rock. It must be Cuddlepie, he thought. When he found little Ragged Blossom lying there so still, he tried to leap onto the rock, calling, will she dry? Will she dry? A little storm petrel hovering above him heard and understood. With a wail of sympathy, he fluttered to her, caught her dress in his bill, and pulled her into the sea. With a shout of joy, Frilly caught her, and calling to his little friend Steady, who was just swimming past, together they carried her home. Great was the rejoicing when they arrived with their burden. Ragged Blossom threw himself into Anne's arms, crying, where is Cuddlepie? Here I am, said Cuddlepie, kissing her. What was the terrible noise? She asked. It was a sea quake, answered Obelia. The fish sauce shop was blown apart, and all the Banksia men and the giant octopus had been thrown into the sharks. Who did that? Asked Ragged Blossom, shuddering. I did, said Obelia. How did Cuddlepie escape? Asked Ragged Blossom. It was the messenger, answered Obelia. Here is my own wonderful fish. You see, I laid a trap to catch the wicked octopus. Why did I get blown up? Asked Ragged Blossom. It was an accident, dear little jellyfish, said Obelia, smiling. That will happen. Alas, strange to tell, not many days later, when Cuddlepie and Ragged Blossom were walking in Anne's lovely garden, another accident happened. A great fish came rushing over the wall. His dark nose shining and his eyes glistening. Swift and straight, he darted at the children, and before he could even cry out, he had opened his huge jaws and swallowed them up. Then with a swish of his tail, he turned and rushed away, away, away.
Hi, I'm Hannah McPherson. I work at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney. It seemed a long, long time to Ragged Blossom and Cuddle Pie, but it couldn't have been more than a few moments, because almost immediately after the greedy fish swallowed them up, he spied the bait on the end of Billy's line and snapped it up. "Got him," shouted Billy. "Haul him in," said his father. "A beauty," chuckled Billy as he swung the fish into the boat. "He'll do nicely for lunch," said Billy's father. "I'll prepare him while you row in." Suddenly he sprang up. "Great Scott!" he exclaimed. "What?" cried Billy, craning forward. "Oh, Father!" he gasped in amazement. "What can it be? Oh, Father, how wonderful!" For there in the middle of the opened fish sat two tiny little creatures. It was Ragged Blossom and Cuddle Pie. While Billy and his father stared with eyes and mouth wide open in utter astonishment, the little things jumped out and ran along the side of the boat. "Catch 'em! Quick, Father, catch 'em!" shouted Billy. "Fill the specimen bottle and we'll put them in," said his father. And without waiting for lunch, Billy and his father hurried home to show everyone their wonderful find. Ragged Blossom and Cuddle Pie clung together in the bottle as the great humans stared at them. Every now and then the big people shook the bottle to make them move, and their poor little heads were quite sore with being bumped against the sides. "Just because we are little, they think we can't feel," said Cuddle Pie, glaring fiercely at the huge face of Billy, who simply did not know any better. At last night came and the humans all went to bed. "I hate humans," said poor Cuddle Pie, pushing at the heavy lid. "Come and help me, Ragged Blossom, it's moving." After much struggling and straining, they managed to lift the lid and clamber out. Then they slid down the tablecloth, ran along the floor, climbed up the window curtain, and in a moment were out on the sill of the open window. The moon was shining. Shh, 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 shh. It was the voice of a possum walking along the bough of a gum tree growing close beside the house. "Mr. Possum," called Cuddle Pie, trembling lest the humans should hear him. "Hello," called back Mr. Possum, lowering himself by his tail to see who it was. "Take us into the tree," cried Ragged Blossom. "We're so frightened the humans will catch us. Oh, quick!" Reaching out his hands, Mr. Possum swung them both up into the tree and took them safely to his little house in the bush nearby. By this time, Ragged Blossom was so worn out and miserable that she fell upon Mrs. Possum's motherly breast and wept. If only Mr. Lizard would come and take us home," she sobbed. "If only he were here." Now the strangest of strange things happened. The door opened and in walked old Mr. Lizard. And who do you think was with him? Why, Snugglepot. When Mr. and Mrs. Possum saw all their visitors throwing their arms about each other's necks and talking and laughing and kissing and dancing about, they held up their hands in surprise. "Get something to eat and drink, my dear," said Mr. Possum, lighting his pipe. It was nearly bird-rise when Snugglepot, Cuddle Pie and Ragged Blossom mounted Mr. Lizard's back and said goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Possum. After a long and happy journey, the travellers arrived at Gumnut Town, and great was the rejoicing and great the amazement when the nuts and blossoms heard of the wonderful adventures. "What became of all the nuts who went with you?" they asked Cuddle Pie. "Alas, that is the sad part of the story. Nobody ever knew." Snugglepot built a new big house and took Cuddle Pie and Ragged Blossom to live with him. Mr. Lizard went off scouring the countryside for little Winky Jerboa. He found him lost and nearly starving. He brought him to Snugglepot, who rejoiced to see him and asked him to be his head gardener and live with him for always. Little Jerboa stuffed his tail into his mouth to hide his tears. He was so happy. But Ragged Blossom missed her baby Obelia. "She's not a baby, she's grown up," said Cuddle Pie. "But I'd like a baby," said Ragged Blossom. "Well, sting and wing me," cried Snugglepot. "You shall have one. Put on your hat and we'll go to the baby shop." It is the habit with Gumnuts to gather up any little homeless bush babies and take them to their baby shop so that anyone who wants to buy an extra baby or two may go to the shop and buy them. Ragged Blossom was delighted, but when she got there, she found it impossible to choose. "I love them all," she sighed. "Then have the lot," cried Snugglepot. "I've plenty of money," he added, slapping his cap. "When you and Cuddlepie were under the sea, Mr. Lizard and I found the Banksia men's treasure." "We'll buy the nurse too," suggested Cuddlepie. "Good roots," said Snugglepot, and so they did. And here is the end of the story of little Obelia. There wasn't really much about her in it, but what was there is very important. For if it hadn't been for baby Obelia, Ragged Blossom wouldn't have stayed behind with the fish folk, and all those wonderful adventures would never have happened. This is the third book of the tales of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. The end.